everybody. This is Deanna Minnick. Welcome to the Detox Summit. Our guest today is Thomas Moore. Dr. Thomas Moore is the author of the classic bestseller, Care of the Soul, which is a #1 New York Times bestseller, as well as 19 other books that he's written. He's been a monk, a musician, a university professor, and for over 30 years, a psychotherapist practicing archetypal therapy with a spiritual dimension. His books appear in over 25 languages, and he lectures in many parts of the world. For 15 years, he has taught psychiatrists and has worked closely with medical schools, hospices, and hospitals. He also speaks often at C.G. Jung societies. He has a PhD in religion from Syracuse University, an honorary doctorate from Lesley University, and the Einstein Humanitarian Award from Yeshiva University. 3 of his books have won the Books for a Better Life Award, and he writes regularly for a number of different magazines and blogs. His most recent book is A Religion of One's Own, published by Gotham and Penguin in January of 2014. He considers himself a brand new form of theologian, drawing from many traditions as well as secular literature and arts. And he's widely known for his efforts to promote and deepen spirituality and make a more soulful society. I have to tell you all, I cannot wait to sink into this interview. How refreshing to have somebody that is so incredibly integrated in their way of thinking and their philosophy, and really has such a beautiful mission to bring forth to the world. Welcome, Thomas, to the Detox Summit.
Thank you, Diane. I'm so happy to be with you today.
Oh, so grateful to have you here. And I can imagine that, your books are so tender, so well written, so profound. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about your own personal journey into where you are today. How did you come to be who you are?
Well, it began by being born into an Irish Catholic family that was very devout, and growing up in a Catholic school and a parish church where I was very close to the priest. I was an altar boy. So it feels to me like from the very beginning, I was interested in religion and close to religion. And so it was quite natural when I was 13 to leave home and to study to be a priest, and also at the same time enter a religious order and live a monastic style of life. And I did that for 13 years and got a lot out of it and enjoyed it. I'm still influenced by those years in monastic life. And then one day I woke up and felt that that part of my life was over. So I knew I had to leave it. So I left quite quickly. And I didn't know what I was going to do for a few years. Eventually found my way toward this doctorate in religion at Syracuse University, where I got the kind of education that was exactly what I needed, just what I needed, studying the world religions, but also depth psychology, psychotherapy, and literature and the arts, all together as one. That was just a wonderful experience for me. And then I taught these things, whatever you want to call that subject, put them all together. I don't know what you'd call it. And I taught it at university for about 8 or 9 years. And then I went on to something new and became a psychotherapist. And then I decided to write up my experiences as a therapist because I felt they were rather unique. And that's what Care of the Soul was. And that made me then a writer and a lecturer, which is what I've been doing ever since.
And tell us about your new book, A Religion of One's Own, and what are you bringing to the world within that book?
I have to tell you, I really feel good about this book. I'm proud of all the books, no matter how well they sold, but this one I really am happy with. It seems to sum up so much of what I've written beforehand and what I've been teaching. It's mainly about a new world coming into the 21st century and no longer surrendering yourself to ready-made religion, but to draw on the religions of the world with great respect, but to draw on them to create your own spiritual path, no longer to give over your life to somebody else who will tell you what to do and how to think, but to figure these things out for yourself based on what you gather from the traditions and from your experiences of life. So I think that's where we are today. We have to do it on our own. And so I'm really happy with this book. People are responding very strongly to it. It feels when I talk about it to groups of people that they were just ready for someone to say it's okay to do this.
Now, based on that premise, it seems like that's very different from what you grew up with, which is Catholicism and really a set form of a dogma and a certain way to live one's life, and really relinquishing a lot over to God. So I'm just kind of curious: is it consistent with your upbringing and those beliefs, or is it something pretty radically different from that in the way of? Well, I guess what's striking me as I'm listening to you is how you said that we have to create our own spiritual path; that it's up to us.
Yes, well, in some ways it is just the opposite of how I grew up. I was taught from the very beginning that I shouldn't have a thought that I was not told, that I shouldn't question a thing, and my own personal views had nothing to do with it. But as I said in describing my journey in this toward where I am today, I went through a lot of changes. I talked about studying different things and reading different authors, that kind of thing, but I can tell you they had a very profound effect on me. Studying the various world religions had a great impact on me and it changed me. So I'm talking about many years of reading and being exposed to different traditions and teachers and leaders. And over those years, I changed a great deal. I do believe today, although many people would disagree with me, I believe that I'm as Catholic as I ever was. I'm still living that tradition in my own way, but I'm no longer in that place where I give over to anyone else to tell me how to do it. I turn to the Catholic writers and the liturgy and so on to help me as resource, but I don't turn to it as an authority.
Hmm. So I'm curious. So, being that this is a summit that is focused on toxicity and how do we come clean, based on all of these influences that you've been exposed to, and as you mentioned, being having these influences of world religions and reading different texts and listening to different teachers, how do you think that religion or our beliefs may have become toxic? Are they toxic? Could they ever be toxic?
Oh, they're probably mostly toxic. There's so much. There is so much that is toxic in religious teaching, the way it has been given to people. I don't mean in the original sources. I think if you go to the Gospels as the source of Christianity, the Gospels are incredibly beautiful. I mean, I've written more than one book to try to say that the Gospels are a magnificent guide for life, but they have been misread and they have been turned into something very toxic. For example, people have been taught, I think, that it's good to suffer. That's a very toxic teaching. It's not good to suffer. It's you should not seek out suffering. A lot of people feel if they suffer, that's a good thing. I don't think that's good. That's a kind of masochism and taking certain kind of pleasure in suffering, and that has hurt a lot of people. And when I travel these days to speak about this book, I will tell people. I say, one of the reasons I wrote this book is because a lot of people are angry with their early experience of religion. And I was surprised when I first started talking this way. People in these groups, hundreds at a time, shake their heads, stand up, nod, groan, shout. They want to say, yes, we are angry. We are angry for what has happened to us. What can we do next? What can we do about it? So I think there's an awful lot of toxicity about the ideas people have been given, about the way they have been taught to behave, to feel bad about themselves, to feel guilt. All of these things, people are angry because they feel that toxicity. It's a spiritual toxicity within them.
And do you think that this spiritual toxicity, do you believe that in your new book that you're giving people lots of tools to transform that the toxin load, or that sense of toxicity that we may have accumulated over time, which could come in the form of anger or guilt?
Yes, I do. I give many, many suggestions of how people can deal with that, with those feelings that they still carry around as adults. I can say here that in my practice of psychotherapy, as you indicated, I've been doing it for 35 years and very deep kind of therapy. I'm always shocked at how many adult problems go back to childhood experiences of religion. So many. There are so many people today, adults, who as children have had these spiritual leaders who have berated them, made them feel bad about themselves, made them feel guilty for the feelings they have had and the desires they have had. Not even to speak about the actual abuse, which is quite serious and widespread, but not even to talk about that. Still, people have had many bad experiences because so many spiritual leaders have been unconscious about their own emotions and their own purposes and agendas. They've been unconscious. They have not had good psychological education. And so they get up there as leaders and they do bad things to people.
Mm. So, what do you recommend? I mean, how do we, let's just say that we have spent decades being infiltrated with so many of those different beliefs, and how do we know what's toxic and what's not? How do we start to weed that out for ourselves and to make sense of it all?
The only way to do it is to grow up. The only way to do it, really, I'm sorry, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
only solution, is to become mature in a more general way.
Mm.
That means, as a person, to start living your own life and not giving it away to somebody else, no matter who they are. Just to take the responsibility for it, there's a weight there. Yeah, you have to take responsibility for your own life, but there's also a great deal of joy in making your own decisions and living a life that you have created. So I recommend whatever it takes to grow up. Now, for some people, that will mean going into therapy. Therapy is a very good thing. I think it's a fantastic thing. That's why I do it. And I teach therapists and I show them great honor when I meet therapists because I think they're doing one of the most important jobs in the world today. But you don't absolutely need therapy, not everybody. Although I don't think it would be a bad thing if everybody in the world went into therapy. But there are other things you can do. And there's a chapter in my book called Self Therapy. I think that you can do this on your own. You can, for example, you can find a friend or somebody you can talk to and very openly and honestly, feeling the emotion of it, tell your story. Tell in detail what you've experienced. Let's say, tell the story of your spiritual life. What happened in your childhood? Was it all good? And you may have to look very close at that, very close, and see maybe that there are some things that happen that have had a bad impact on you, and you still feel them today.
Well, that you're right. That is definitely a great place to start in terms of owning and really getting into the deeper dive of looking at our past and where we've come from. And, I would think too, as we're talking about detox and we're talking about health topics, that many times when people have a health crisis of some sort, they start to catalyze this part of their journey. Everything that you're speaking about, really starting to look at emotions, starting to look at their thinking patterns, even their belief system. They start to reevaluate their family, their communities, their values. And so I'm curious if you've seen that in therapy as well and in your work in hospitals.
Yes, I have been visiting hospitals now for about 5 or 6 years. I wrote a book called Care of the Soul in Medicine. And so I talk to doctors, nurses, and patients quite frequently. And patients tell me, in fact, I remember several people just surrounded by tubes and people working on them and telling me in that setting that their illness woke them up. Their illness helped them realize what was important to them and especially helped them realize that they had to tend to relationships with their family members, with their sons and daughters and spouses, with their co-workers, people like that. So the illness becomes a waking up, and in that sense, the illness itself is a spiritual waking, a spiritual benefit to people.
I really like that analogy of a waking up. I also think of it as a reset button where we get to recalibrate and redefine where we are. And I can imagine that people go through stages. You mentioned the emotions of guilt and anger, and maybe those are directed towards God, towards themselves, towards the situation, and they're not really sure what to do with all of those emotions. So I can imagine that initially that might come across as being a form of toxicity, right? They just don't know what to do with all of this. They're put in this situation. Why me? Why did this happen? And I'm sure that that's more or less the natural process of how this unfolds.
Yes, even very spiritually sophisticated people get into this place. I had a friend an Irish writer, John Moriarty, a very good friend of mine, and he found that he had cancer, terminal cancer, and he went into a terrible place. He lost everything, all of his faith and his trust, all of it. And he did say, "Why me and why now? I have things to do. And what caused this? And who did this to me?" And I used to have a very positive attitude, and now I don't. And he did go through phases. He went through that for I'd say about a year. And then he came out of it, and it was an entirely different place. I think that's a good model that when people are angry and frustrated and don't know what to do, what to say, I think we should allow them to be in that place, not think that it's bad, that there's something wrong, but that this moment is a moment and it will lead somewhere else. And the only way they can get to a better place is to go through this moment.
I like that because it puts us in the present moment. And sometimes I think that so much of therapy is going into the past and really digging deep into our childhood. So I like the idea of really being focused on the present moment and seeing what opportunity we can create there. And I think creating that true integration between the past, the present, and the future, and what we're visioning out is perhaps the best of all. How do we bring them all together? And they're all truly the same anyway, and we find them all in that present moment.
Yes, I agree completely with that. I'm not a great advocate of living in the here and now. I always say I tend to live in the there and then myself because I love the past. I feel like I was born about 500 years, too late. So I appreciate the past, and in my work, I appreciate stories that people tell of the past. On the other hand, the telling is really of the present. And I don't want to confuse those things. So when people are telling their story, they're really very much in the present. And they're talking about the present because those stories of the past are always a bit metaphorical. They're not as literal as we take them to be. When we tell the stories of what happened to us, these toxic events that happen in the past, as we tell them, we're really talking about the present. So I wouldn't want to get that confused. We have to have a bit of a poetic and metaphorical mindset when we do this.
I really like that you mentioned that, the idea of looking at the symbolic. And even one of my teachers, Carolyn Mace, talks about how the symbolic or symbolism is really the terrain of the soul. And the literal is the terrain of the physical world. That's what we're dealing with and what we see. It's the visible. So I'm curious, I'd like to ask you this question, which is a little bit more philosophical. As we talk about toxicity, of course, we can talk about the literal. We can talk about the pollutants. We can talk about the chemicals and all the contaminants. And I'm just wondering, from a symbolic, poetic perspective, how do you see toxicity? What's happening on a larger, grander scale to society that we even need to have a summit to talk about toxicity and detox? What's the greater meaning here of toxicity?
Well, one of the greater meanings of it I would get from Jung and writings around Jung, and that is that toxicity is a form of shadow, as a symbolic thing. If you think of it as an image, just talking about the toxic, people maybe 500 years ago would talk about the devil. They wouldn't talk about the toxicity. They talk about the devil, what the devil is doing to us. I think we have to be careful that we don't literalize toxicity too much. And in that literalization, it takes us to a place where all we want to think about is how to get rid of it. It might be better to think, what is the role of toxicity? What is it doing in our experience? Does it have a place? Should we just set up these warfares, a war against pain, a war against suffering, a war against poisoning the world and all of that? Or should we rather be more in tune with it and say, well, what is the toxicity doing for us? Do we need to experience it somehow? Is it part of life? Isn't it more realistic to look at life and say, well, life is always full of toxicity? People get sick. Can you imagine human life without sickness? It gives us good things. What about getting emotionally ill and having these bad things that happen to us? Is that just literally bad? Or can we get somewhere in a positive way through those experiences? Is it better to maybe really live life and take on the bad things as well as the good things, rather than just imagine a carefree life? It might be better, more real, to include the light and the dark and the toxic and the healthy.
Well, that is certainly very deep. I like that idea of being more accepting of the toxicity. And I also like what you said about if we were to define this 500 years ago, we might be talking about it in a different way. We would use different language, the evil, if you will. And I'm wondering if we even coin toxicity as bad, are we already putting it into a category and separating it out rather than just saying it is? You know, there are always going to be toxins. And so what we have to tend to is really our internal space and in the environment that we create within.
Well, there are two stages here, two phases of what we're talking about. One is the toxicity itself, is saying that it is, are there bad things in life? The second thing is seeing things, seeing through things, seeing the stories that we're telling, the image of toxicity, not just the literal fact of toxicity. So, what is the image? What is the whole story about it? What is the story about trying to fight it and to battle it? Is that the only way to deal with it? We know in medicine, a homeopathic approach to toxicity would be very different, where you try to use some toxicity in order to regain health. That's a different point of view, and it's I think, a very legitimate one. Can we think that way emotionally and psychologically and spiritually? Let's say someone who's had a really bad experience, let's say that someone as a child had a spiritual leader who was abusive or at least treated that person badly and gave them some bad advice. I've heard of experiences from several people, some of them my clients, who talk about their very pious spiritual leaders treating them inappropriately sexually, that kind of thing. Okay, so you had that experience. So that person comes to me for therapy. What do I do? What do I do with it? Well, what I try to do with it is to help a person tell that story and not just become heroic in response to it and go out and fight men or fight spiritual leaders or say that everyone should be perfect. We can't do that. Rather, we say, what do you do with this experience of having this toxic experience of the spiritual? What do you do with it? Who are you then? Maybe that kind of person is better off teaching people. Maybe that kind of person could be a counselor to the people who actually perpetrate these things. There are different ways of looking at the positive aspects of what is toxic.
Yes, and in so many of the expert interviews that I've been doing, what I'm hearing from people is that the way that they got into medicine was because of their own personal journey and their personal health issues. That some of these were medical doctors who were developing conditions in medical school. And when they went to go see a physician and physicians, because they really went beyond just one practitioner, not hearing a solution, what ended up becoming their path was to help people with a different way around medicine. So if they hadn't had that experience, they may not have rolled that into their own medical practice when they were done with medical school. So I think what you're saying is really beautiful, because there are ways that we can turn, if you will, the saying lemons into lemonade. We can really experience the culmination, the learning of these events in our life in a positive way and turn them around.
Yes, there's even another way to look at it too, and this is more personal for me. I don't know if you want to go this far into it, but for me as a therapist, I sit there with people and I know that I'm as neurotic as they are. I remember when I was first starting out studying psychology, there was a time when humanistic psychology was very prominent. And I ran into some teachers who presented themselves as though they were perfectly healthy. I mean, they were these specimens of what it means to be a fully realized human being. And I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to be that. I'm too mixed up to be able to do that. But eventually I got over that. And in my practice, I realized that I have my own issues. And you might say, using this language of today's discussion, I have my own toxicity, my own emotional, psychological toxicity, and spiritual toxicity. I've had some really bad experiences from spiritual leaders in the past. So I sit there with people and I realize that that's who I am. And yet here I am being very confident in my work as a therapist, feeling completely adequate to sitting there and dealing with these people's situations. I think I'm better off having had those experiences than if I didn't have them. And I trust people who have really lived life, who have had bad experiences and don't deny them and don't try to get around them, but rather realize that this is what it means to live. When we live as human beings, we have good experiences, we have bad ones. We acknowledge them, we own them, and we go ahead then and we exercise our creativity out of those good and bad experiences.
I really like what you're saying because it does open up the door for more self acceptance. And when we love and accept ourselves, we might make different choices about our lives. And we're not aspiring to be this person on a pedestal or this perfect being. And with one of the other speakers, we were talking about the toxicity of perfectionism. And where does this come from? Especially in the self help world, the personal growth world, that people have to be perfect in order to teach. And do you think that that is another form of, well, similar to what you were saying about religion, where there are kind of these poisons that get disseminated about how we have to be, how we have to live? Do you think that perfectionism is one of those things, especially in our busy societies where people have to feel like they have to do it all? They've got to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect worker, employee. How do we take that energy of perfectionism and transform it? What would be your guidance?
Well, yes, perfection is really a problem. In the catalog of disorders and toxicities, I would put perfectionism on the list for sure. But we don't use that word. Not many people say, I want to be perfectionistic or I want to be perfect. We use different words for it. We use the word just healthy sometimes. This is a healthy thing to do. That's not a healthy thing to do. I always react against that kind of talk because it's really moralistic talk. I'd rather just enjoy life and all of its complexity and not divide it up into what's healthy and what's not healthy. That's very closely related, by the way, to the word normal. I also would put normal on my toxic list. It's not so good to be normal either. When we are really being ourselves and living from a deep place within ourselves, we're going to be eccentric and unusual, it seems to me, rather than normal. And so a lot of people, though, feel very bad if they are not, when they're not considered normal. And that seems to be a judgment and something they are uncomfortable with. So I think that becoming a less toxic person might mean being comfortable with your eccentricity and your abnormality. Another word that in my family we used from Japan, we like the word wabi sabi, which is the word used in art and Japanese aesthetics to mean some piece of art or some piece of furniture, something like that, that is very imperfect. It may have moss growing on it, it may have cracks in it, it may be old and falling apart, and yet has its own beauty. We like that in my family. Wabi sabi as an example of how to be, not to be healthy and normal, but to be wabi sabi, just yourself, and imperfect where you have to be imperfect.
Oh, then what about our goal driven society? Aren't we taught from a very early age? And I've been to Catholic school all my life. There's that rigor and the discipline about aspiring, striving. And I think in the Eastern religions and philosophies, we see a different tone, just like you mentioned, the wabi sabi. So, what have you seen with your sampling of all of these world religions? How is this really taken in different cultures and in different belief systems? Are the Americans really through our system, and I know that we're kind of a medley, just lots of different people, lots of different cultures, but the society that we've created around goals, it seems very strong, and it seems like we'll never be happy.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We are a goal-directed society, certainly. And what would happen if you gave up the idea of having these goals? I think it would be very interesting. When I give workshops, I really avoid any kind of goals. I mean, I have to list goals in order for people to get their qualifications if they study with me. But that's sort of an exercise because it lets us know that the society wants goals. It wants us to head always be on a ladder going up. We can't just be where we are. We have to be going somewhere. And that's part of that perfectionism. We get it in the phrase personal growth also. Maybe at times we don't need to grow so much. Maybe we'll be in a point where we're slipping backwards, and that might be very valuable. So all of these terms we have for perfectionism, like growth, being normal, getting somewhere, making progress, all of those things they may have their place in certain circumstances, but we overdo them and we become enslaved to them. And so I think it's good to criticize them and find alternative ways of describing what it is we're after.
It'd be so interesting just for everybody, all the listeners, just to imagine what it would be like to not have goals, just to have a day where you're not focused on goals, actually to have that day of rest in in a true sense, because I think, now we're going 24/7 and people are on kind of autopilot. We're not really self-aware because we're so directed on the outside.
That would be good. That'd be good exercise sometime to write a list of goals and then tear it up. Uh, just to because the goals are there and they are a fantasy, but they do, to keep our word here, they do have a toxicity about them because they make us anxious. They take the joy out of living. They can take away the spontaneity and especially the self-acceptance, because if you're trying to reach a goal, you're never going to really get there. You never really fulfill those goals completely. And so there develops over time a judgment against oneself. And the critic, so many people say the critic inside them is so strong that they have a hard time being creative. All these bad things come out of having goals and trying to get somewhere instead of just being where you are.
Although, if we listen to many of the teachers that are talking with us now at a more of a societal level, and the messages that we're hearing, even in the spiritual realm, is that thought begets matter. And so if we're not creating the thought of where we want to go, we'll just kind of happen to be wherever we end up. And so how do you reconcile that way of thinking about creating the framework of where you want to go versus creating goals? Maybe it's just a matter of degree. Maybe it's not goals about everything, but goals about some things. Maybe there's that happy balance there. So we don't have to let go of them entirely, but maybe find some place of rhythm and balance.
Well, forgive me, Deanna, but I really don't think balance is a good place to be.
Good. All right. Tell us more. And what is balance, right? That's a hard word to define.
To me, balance is it's probably a subcategory of perfectionism. It's like that middle place, and it sounds nice, and it's quite intellectual because we never quite get into that balance. I think I'm always talking about the soul, and the soul really operates from passion. And the passionate life is never balanced. You're always off balance. One time you're feeling one thing very strongly, and another time it's opposite. And you're going back and forth if you're passionate, if you're living a passionate life. You're not living a balanced life. I don't think that's a good goal for us to live a balanced life. But forgive me for saying that, but that's just,
I think it's great.
It's the way I normally think about these things. The other thing I have to say is that for the life of me, I don't get this philosophy. You have to think about your future and you have to create it somehow. It's a kind of old-fashioned, simplistic existentialism that doesn't make any sense to me. To me, the way you live life is by responding to the invitations, reading the signs every day, not worrying about tomorrow, living the life that's offered to you every day and every minute as you go. That takes a different way of life. It's not, if you're preparing and if you're planning ahead of time, I think you have to think it through. You have to have these thoughts to be able to make it happen. That is existential anxiety. That means anxiety of living. It's not a psychological personal anxiety, it's the anxiety of living. I don't like that approach at all. I would never advocate it. And all my work moves in a different direction, more in the realm of intuition and looking for guidance and taking risks and taking chances and letting yourself be guided by the moment and not guided intellectually at all.
So well said. I'm sinking into every word you're saying, and then there's a part of me that's saying, gosh, but he has done so much. He's written 19 books, and you have to have some structure to do that. And and in and of itself, somehow these, even you conveying and communicating your concepts, it's a
Oh,
beautiful
no.
process, right? And it doesn't have to be a goal; it can be a sharing, and really how we frame it up, it's all about the context, I think, and that's what I'm thinking. I'm taking away from what you're saying, but perhaps you can refine that further for us.
Sure. I am not an ordered person, and I get books written because I love writing. I can't stop myself. I should be doing something else. And if I get through a day and I haven't written a paragraph or two, I don't feel good. I may have to get up in the middle of the night to write these things. So it's a passionate thing. I have no discipline about it, really. I don't have a discipline. I have a great passion to write. And I love to write beautiful things, so I have to work at them. And I have to train myself to write well. I have to work at it. I read all kinds of books about writing, not because I'm disciplined and I'm teaching myself in a kind of a school way, but that I'm passionate. I really want to get it.
Mm.
And other things in life fall apart then. I have several people angry at me today because I haven't done all the things they need for the talks I have to give at their places around the world. I just can't do everything. So there's a lot of mess around. There's not much discipline, but things get done out of passion.
Really reminds me of Janet Atwood's work on the passion test, and really identifying your passion, and then everything flows from there.
I
Thomas,
like,
I definitely want to talk with you about one last thing before we close this conversation, and that is something that intrigues me. As you started our interview, you were talking about your interest in literature, in the arts, and psychotherapy. How do you think that we need to bring more of the arts into our everyday life, and is that a healing modality for us as people? And are we not honoring our sense of creativity to the extent that we could perhaps?
well, there are different ways of doing the arts. One is to participate as a spectator and listener, like listening to music and going to concerts and that sort of thing, going to museums, looking at paintings. The other way is to be creative in the work. Both ways are very helpful and very health promoting, I would say. But I think the problem is that we don't understand what the arts are. We think of them as entertainment. The majority of people seem to still think that artists are representing the physical world somehow, that they are looking at the world and putting it on a canvas, the visual artist. But they're not. It's so obvious they are not. They are looking at the world and they are being inspired somehow to find some level of meaning, and they put that meaning, that emotional, intellectual mystery meaning, onto their canvas. And we can look at that canvas then, contemplate it, meditate on it for a long time, and be taken to a place very similar to where we're taken in our night dreams, where we discover the level of life that really counts, that actually our lives are dreams in many ways. And there's an underside to our lives, and that's what we see in the arts. So I think that the arts are absolutely essential to us for our own depth. And I don't know any other resource we have. I guess we do have the religions, which are very close, but actually, the religions for centuries have used the arts for this purpose in order to take us into that deep place that is far beyond what we can find intellectually.
What are some of your favorite things to do artistically, and how do you get into your landscape of soul?
I play the piano every day. That's one
Ah.
thing I do. I play the pieces. In fact, just this morning, I was playing some pieces that I first started playing when I was 14 years old. I play those pieces, and I play classical music primarily. And I play those things, and I'm taken away. I'm swept away, and I'm swept into the music. And playing really helps because my fingers are engaged, and my whole body really listening to it very closely. And the pleasure of doing that, the joy of it, and the memory, remembering playing the same music all these years, year after year, entering into the imagination of the person who wrote this music, all of it. It's a deep, deep, pleasurable form of meditating for me.
Hmm. I like the sound of it. I can almost get a feeling of that experience. And, it's so interesting that you say that it's a form of meditating for you, because many times we think we have to sit in silence and do the om and, or we just have to sit there and try to be silent. And there are different ways to really tap into one's soul. And I really like that you use classical music and playing the piano. That's really beautiful. Thomas, I'd like to ask you to perhaps summarize for the listeners perhaps three main takeaways from our conversation as it relates to what you really would like for them to remember, or perhaps small things even that they could put into action, just things that circle back to our theme of toxicity. So what would be the top three takeaways from our discussion that you'd like to leave everybody with?
The first thing is to know what has been toxic in your life, psychologically and spiritually. To know it, don't ignore it. You may have pushed it aside. It's very important to know what has been toxic for you. And if you don't know it, then take some time to remember, to write some things down. Talk to somebody who you can trust, who's close to you, a friend or a relative, spouse, somebody. And do it very openly and honestly, and you will discover something about yourself that's very important. That's the first step. The second thing I'd like people to take away would be that it's so important to live your own life and not somebody else's. Live your own life. Take a chance. Do things that you're inspired to do. Take risks. Find the joy of living your own life. Notice those places where you are doing something just because somebody else expects you to or somebody has told you you should. That's not a good motive. That's not a mature way to live. That's a child's way to live. So you have to grow up and wake up, grow up, and live your own life. That's a very, very important thing. And the third thing would be we all need help. We all need guidance. We need resources. We need the best resources. So we've talked about some that are excellent here. The best resources I know are the world's spiritual and religious traditions. If you haven't read some of the Old Testament and the Jewish resources, then try it, get them. Read some from the Kabbalah. Look at those great images of the Kabbalah. If you haven't read the Tao Te Ching from China, try that. Some great Sufi poets like Rumi. Read those poets. If you haven't read a good translation of the Gospels, do that. The great mystics, read them. That we have great resources in that regard. We also have resources in the arts. Teach yourself to listen to music. I mean, listen to all kinds of music, but really listen to it. Make it important in your life. Find an art for yourself that you can do yourself. Try it. Try writing some poetry. Try drawing. Try painting. Try sculpting. Try music. Try any art at all, dance, gardening. Become an artist. If you are not an artist, you're not complete. So these would be my three primary suggestions of how to go from here and deal with toxicity.
How inspiring. I really like that last one. If you're not an artist, you're not complete. And so, really tapping into our artist selves. That's really beautifully said. Thank you, Thomas, for being with us for the Detox Summit. It's so wonderful to have you and your energy as part of this movement and really shifting how we think, what we believe, our emotions, talking about all these relevant topics. And I think this is just wonderful, healthy discussion. So thank you so much for being a part of this. It's really been an honor.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be able to have a chance to do this. It's not easy to be able to spout off like this very often. You don't have the opportunities to really express your own philosophy, and I feel that and have enjoyed it and appreciate your part in that.